Well, good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here for your homecoming service. Appreciate the invitation, Kenneth. I was thinking about church there in Rogers. That's where the church used to be located, right? Was Pastor DeHart there? Was he still there in 1969? You said you're his daughter? Okay. I don't believe I ever met him, but the thought came back to me this morning. Second attempt I made at preaching, it was at that church. I don't know what the circumstances was. I think Pastor DeHart was away, and I'd already preached my first sermon over at Faith Missionary Baptist up on the hill. Brother Birch gave me that opportunity. And in my second opportunity, I guess Brother Birch had been in touch with Pastor DeHart, and I preached there. Tried to preach there. It was the second time that I'd ever tried preaching. And I learned that morning that preaching the same sermon, it wasn't a good experience. And I learned some things that day as a teenager. But we, that year, I went on to Bible college from Christiansburg here and went on down to Winston-Salem. And after I got out of Bible college and was in ministry there for a short while, North Carolina, we went to Brazil in 1978. And I guess as long about that time that Russell Gordon got me in touch with Brother Dusty. And like he said, the church down in Shawsville started supporting us. And then when Dusty was at church in Rogers, continued to, and passed over to Bible Baptist here. And so we're very fortunate to have had this relationship with the church through the years. So this is my home here in Christiansburg. That's where I was born and raised. And I got roots down on the Yellow Sulphur Road. That's where my dad was raised. Grew up down there. And still have kin folks down there. I think I've told you, Brother Stump, before that I've got kin to some Stumps down there. My last surviving aunt lives down that road. My brother and I saw her yesterday. And a couple of my cousins who live over here just off of what's the name of that street down Woodrow Drive, Woodrow something up here, back out here just a little ways. I invited them yesterday to come to church here, and they didn't come. I knew it'd be a miracle if they did come, but I did invite them, and gave them your card with the address and your phone number, so who knows if God can do things that we don't expect sometimes, but they haven't been in church. I don't guess they may have gone some during their life, but not much. I don't know of any church that they're attending right now. Said they weren't going anywhere, and they aren't, and they're got some health issues in the family. And one little boy that I didn't know about, he's actually, I guess, a third cousin or something like that, was 10 years old and has a disease called, I wrote it down because I'd never heard of that disease, Alpers disease, and he's born with it. And they lost a child 10 years ago with it, died when he was 3. And at that time, the mom was pregnant with another one, which is the current one, who's 10 years old. And people with this disease don't normally live to be past 10. And he's 10 and on a ventilator. And I guess near the end of his little life. Didn't get to see him, but didn't know about him. But if you think of us, the Nunleys, and our kin folks here, they're not Christian people, but live here right in the community, and they have real need for the Lord. But it's kind of a sobering thing. Go down and walking in the cemetery, little family cemetery there off Yellow Sulphur Road, and finding my grandmother's grave there, and one of my aunts buried there too. and see the graves are practically unmarked now, but still able to locate them there. But anyhow, that's some of our roots here, and I grew up there on the other side of Christiansburg, and got saved at the Main Street Baptist Church in Christiansburg back in 1959. The house we're living in, one of the first pictures I put on the wall in the room that's going to be my study is a picture of that old church building there on Main Street, right across the street from the Presbyterian Church. Used to be on the other side of the street, used to be the Palace Theater there, but I took a picture of that building some years ago, and I remember standing on the front steps. I thought they were pretty big steps when I was a kid, but I was like, almost 8 years old, but it's about 2 or 3 steps, goes right down the sidewalk, and you're about right on the street. But I remember standing out there the morning that trusted the Lord. I went out there by myself because I couldn't stop crying, and I didn't want people to see me. I was kind of shy, and so I just went out the front door and stood on the front steps until I got things together. But so when I come to Christiansburg, we'll come home. But Rena, she's with me this morning. She's been my wife for, it will be, it's 2021. It'll be 47 years in July that we got married there in North Carolina, and spent about 41 of those years down in Brazil. And of course, we got to know the Wells down there and had good times together, good ministry together there with Kenneth's dad, George, and also with Kenneth and Donna. We had some good opportunities together. And Kenneth did a whole lot for the Bible college there. And I don't know, did you say you got a whole lot of furniture from Virginia Tech and sent down there, and those desks and big long desks, nice desks and chairs and things, they're still being utilized. And we had the opportunity to teach there at school for about 18 years. But right now, as already been mentioned this morning, we're in pastoral ministry there in Mocksville, North Carolina, just outside of Winston-Salem. And the church had been without a pastor for about 4 years, and so it's an older congregation, more mature congregation like we folks here this morning, and not too many young people, but I kind of say in jest sometimes that Rena and I are part of the young people's group at the church, and not too many people older than we are. Of course, when you get to be 70 years old, you can't find too many people older than you are anyhow. You can only get so old and you just check out. We all understand that. But teaching at Christian school there in Lexington, North Carolina, the pastor invited us to teach there right after we came home on furlough. And somebody said they heard the pastor invite me and said, I knew when you said yes, you didn't know what you were getting into. And I didn't, because teaching high school kids Bible, trying to. But it's been a real challenge. And learning experience for me kind of stretched the old guy. And because I've been teaching Bible college to young people who are a little bit older, young people, around in their 20s, but paying to go to Bible college is a whole lot different teaching somebody that goes wanting to learn than teaching teenage kids who don't want to be in Bible class sometimes, don't even want to be in school. So I got 57 students, and somebody said, well, somebody's got to teach them, so I was at somebody for a while. But school will be out 28th of May, and I'm not going back. They need somebody younger and somebody that understands young people a lot better. But I'll be looking forward to getting more involved in the pastorate there. They've talked about the wage that they want to pay me, and I said, well, just keep me on the supply pastor category, because I can't be a real pastor to you right now because I'm teaching, I'm supposed to have 20 classes a week. I say supposed to. I never know when the school's going to cancel one or my students are gone doing some kind of activity, and then they win something in the activity, and a couple weeks later they give them another day off from school for the reward. And so it's kind of kept me guessing as to how to prepare for the classes. Well, this morning we'll be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3. Pastor Kenneth, how long do you say I have here? What time y'all get through? 11:45? Okay. All right. So if I'm 14 or 13 till 11, that won't be a real big problem. 1 Timothy chapter 3. First Timothy chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. This letter to Timothy, Paul said he wanted to know how to behave himself in the house of God. We understand very simply that he wanted him to know how to lead the church or conduct the church. It's not like child discipline. I was remembering my dad, few times he went to that church there at Main Street Baptist. My dad wasn't a Christian at that time, but he did enforce some discipline. But I remember sitting in the church pew one Sunday morning for a preaching service that we hardly ever went to, but a little girl sitting in front of me, she had looking back at me, and I was kind of looking at her. I didn't think there was anything really significant going on. She dropped something on the floor, rolled it under the bench, and I bent down and picked it up and gave it to her. But after we got out of church, my dad said, when we were in the car going home, if you ever behave like that again in church, I'm going to give you a horse beating. And horse beatings is, not really horse beating, but just you're going to really get it. That's just an expression we use. But I was learning how to behave in church with my dad and with my mom also. But of course, Paul wasn't talking about that kind of behavior as he wrote to Timothy, that you ought to know how to behave yourself in the house of God, but being able to conduct the church in a way that's honorable and pleasing to God. And so that's what we want to talk about this morning, conducting ourselves properly in the church. Paul had also mentioned to Titus when he wrote in Titus chapter 1 and in verse 5, he said, "For this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city as I appointed thee." So part of having the church in order that Titus was responsible for was to ordain elders, and they had leaders and wanted things to be set in order, setting things right in that particular church too. I think it's interesting how easily and how quickly a church can get out of order, so to speak. The last church that we were responsible for there in Brazil, they had been without a pastor for a short time. But in his last year or so there, he was not really doing the work that a pastor should be doing. He got in financial trouble and got the church's testimony hurt in the community because of what he was doing. But they asked Rena and me to go there as missionaries to help them get things back together. And so we were there, and in the beginning I noticed that one day after Sunday school they got in a little discussion about who was going to sweep the church. And one of the leaders said, well, if you don't sweep the church is just not going to be swept. And the grass was about a foot and a half high are the weeds in certain places in the front yard in a neighborhood where people cut their grass and things look pretty nice, and they weren't cutting the grass. And one of the leaders that they had, the primary leader in the church, he wasn't the most spiritual guy that I ever seen. I sat down and talked with him after I'd been there for a while, and I said, "Have you ever read the New Testament through?" And he said, "No, I haven't." And he was teaching the adult Sunday school class and found out that he had had some real serious marital problems, and they put him in the church leadership. And we found out that the bank account was locked down, and yet they were collecting fees every month from the church account. They were taking the church's money, but because they had not updated the information that you have to do in Brazil to keep a bank account running with an organized church, they were taking our money and we couldn't close the account. So it was just a lot of things that needed to be set in order. The church that we're pastoring there now, when they interviewed me a few months ago, I said, "Well, how many members do you have here?" And they said, "We have 200. And I said, "Well, how many are active?" Because I knew 200 weren't showing up for church. And I said, "How many are active?" And they said, "Well, about 40. And I said, "Why? Why do you have 200 on the roll and 40 that are active?" Now, I'm not criticizing the church that we love that we're working with now, but the deacons and I, we agreed that we're going to work on that to try to get a membership in order that's meaningful, that means something for a person to be a member of a church. It needs to be in order, and found out that several churches don't have that in order. But as we look at this particular passage, thinking about how we should conduct ourselves properly in the church. 3 reasons that I'll give you here in the next few minutes. First of all, one of the things we can do to conduct ourselves properly in the church, we do it by living as a family. Living as a family. And we look in verse 15. The idea comes from this verse. "But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God." The word house there can be understood as household, and household can be understood as people living under the same roof that constitute a family, and the church is presented as a family, as a household in this particular verse. Of course, Paul has 3 images that he uses here in these verses: the house of God, and then the church of the living God. And then he says it's the pillar and ground of the truth, and these are the aspects that we'll be looking at this morning. But living as a family. Families have order, and in a family, if it's a normal biblical family, the parents are in the leadership, the dad's the head of the house, and the wife, she is responsible for things inside the house. They're both responsible for raising children. They give the orientation. And of course, we don't see that working a whole lot maybe in our homes today, that children many times tell their parents what to do. They determine the rules in a household. But Paul, as he talked to Timothy and the qualifications for pastors and qualifications for deacons, he mentioned that the house needed to be in order. For example, verse 4 of chapter 3, "One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity." And then as he talked about the deacons in verse 12, "Let the deacons be the husband of one wife, ruling their children and their own houses well." So living as a family, as we talk about the church conducting itself properly, you do that by living as a family with order. Normal families, biblical families, they have order. I was mentioning that my dad has roots here in Cambria, or on the Yellow Sulphur Road where he grew up. And my dad, when we were at home, Dad was the one that made the rules at home. Of course, Mom did too, but she was in submission to him. And I was talking with my brother yesterday, who's 12 years younger than I, and there's kind of 2 sets of children. I was in part of the older set, and then my brother and little sister, they were in the younger set. And so I don't know what all went on in their lives after I went home. But I said, when you were at home, I said, did Dad take y'all down to see his mother about every Sunday? He said, yeah. I said, after church and after we had our meal on Sunday, we'd get in the car and go down and see his mother, go down the Alsace Road. And that's called Dad wanted to do that. And when I was at home, I remember sometimes during the summer I wanted to do what I want to do, play around out in the country there on the other side of Christiansburg and just have a good time. And Dad said, we're going fishing today. Well, I don't want to go fishing. Well, you get ready to go fishing anyhow. So he determined the things. He gave some order in the house, and I'm glad he did. He taught me about not laying in bed too late on Saturdays. He said you need to get up and get things going so you won't be all grouchy around and sleep too long on Saturdays. So Dad determined that. He gave some order in the house. So living in a family with order, a church should have order, and of course the structure of a pastor and deacons and the leadership, giving a good example, but also living as a family with love and respect. Families have brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, and ought to love and respect each other. And Paul mentioned that in chapter 5. If you look at chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, where he said, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, and the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. And so here we see love and respect, that Paul is not saying that you couldn't talk to each other about problems maybe, but older men, they should be entreated. They should be treated as a father with love and respect. And the younger men like your brothers. Brothers, they might get in a fight once in a while, but usually they get things straightened out. They love each other. And you treat the elder women like mothers. And I'm, of course, aware of that in the church that we have. A lady, a few weeks ago, she turned 90 years old. And another lady, she turned 80 years old. And most of the ladies in our church are older than I. And they might need some orientation from time to time, but if they do, I need to treat them as if I were talking with my mother. And the younger ladies in the church, treat them like your sisters with all purity. And so living as a family with order, living as a family with love and respect, and living also as a family, let's say, with discipline. Discipline. Families have discipline, and probably all of us, we had some bragging rights about how we were disciplined when we were little. I think it's interesting about that. When you're home, you get a spanking, that type of thing. You think it's pretty bad when it's happening. But I've noticed even among the students at the school, once in a while we've talked about discipline because we've been studying the book of Proverbs, and it talks about it. And the kids, it's like, I was at home and my parents, they just beat me because I was doing it. And I thought, wow, parents are still beating their kids. And, they use the word beat, just like I was telling a little bit ago about horse beating and this type of stuff. But it's like their eyes brighten up and they get excited about telling that they got disciplined at home. And all of us would probably have, our stories. I used to get whipped with a belt, or Mom would make me go out and get my own switch, and then and we had kind of have these bragging rights about how we used to get disciplined. But one of the things I've noticed here at churches in the States, and have been aware of this for a long time, is that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of discipline applied in the churches. The church that we're at now, we're looking through the Constitution and the church and the requirements for church membership. And I mentioned this to the deacons, and they were already aware of it. I mentioned it to the church. I said, the Constitution says that if you're away from church for a year and you don't show up, you can be eliminated from the church membership. Well, you think about that a little bit, and you say, well, if you show up once a year, you're okay. And you think, what kind of secret organization or Masons or Rotary Club, what kind of member, do they treat their members like that? You show up once a year and we won't have anything to say to you. But Baptist churches function like that. And Easter Sunday, was an older gentleman showed up, and a couple ladies sat with him. I'd never seen him before, and was glad to see him, And after the service was over, I was talking with the deacons. I said, "Who is that gentleman that came?" He told me his name, and I'd forgotten or something. They said, "Well, that's Brother So-and-so," and I said, "He's a member of the church." Well, I've been preaching there every Sunday almost since January, and I said, "I hadn't seen him. Didn't know he was a member of the church. Where does he live?" "Oh, just out the road." I think that communicates a message that's dangerous to church people who have their names on the church roll, and the church doesn't say anything about it. You're okay. And we're kind of giving our seal of approval on your relationship to Christ. And we don't see you in church hardly ever, or you hadn't been here for years. But that's okay. You just keep being a member. But that's kind of and I know health problems enter in. I understand that. We've got folks who haven't been to church there for years, but they're shut-ins. They can't get there. And I understand that, driving at night and this type of thing after you get older. But that's not the situation that we would be disciplined. But Paul said in chapter 5 and in verse 19, he said, "Against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Them that sin rebuke before all, that others may also fear." Now here's 2 verses that says the elder, the pastor, he can be publicly rebuked. He can have his sins corrected. And so if a pastor can have his sins corrected publicly, the members should have that same application made to them. Rebuke before all, that the others may fear, Paul said. So living as a family has discipline. We must conduct ourselves properly in the church, living as a family. And then the second thing, as we think about the word church in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, where he says, "Behave thyself in the house of God," or the household of God. That's the idea of the family, which is the church of the living God. And the word church here could be translated very simply, assembly. Assembly. When you assemble, that means you get together. The church of the living God, the assembly of the living God. And of course there's one religious group that calls themselves the Assembly of God. That is a biblical name, assembly. Church is an assembly. It's a called out assembly. So meeting together is part of the way of conducting ourselves properly in the church. You can't have an assembly unless people get together. And that's one thing that we've thought about more in this context of COVID. That people who really want to get together have resisted the laws that come from our leaders and saying, "We don't want you to get together. You can't get together." And of course, churches have been on lockdown. We understand that. And there's been cooperation to a certain point. But we Christian people don't understand when they say, "You folks can't meet together, but if you want to go to the bar, you can get together. It's all right." And you think, well, what's going on here? Something doesn't seem right. You can't have a church unless you meet. Church means assembly. But people have this idea sometimes that, I'll just do church at home. The idea, you don't have to go to church if you're a Christian. And we understand that, again, in the context of being sick, not being able, or somebody, the dad at home, or somebody saying, "You can't go to church, you have to stay." Yeah, you can be a Christian and not go to church. But if you're a Christian and you don't have these restrictions of health, or somebody else that's above you in the home making you stay, Christian people meet together. I had an aunt to talk with some time ago. She's I'm not sure. She says she's a Christian, but she doesn't go to church, never been baptized. And she said, I'll just stay at home and watch Charles Stanley. And I said, well, Charles Stanley's a good preacher. But I said, if you keep listening to Charles Stanley, I said, he'll probably tell you that you need to be in church and baptized member and being in a church with other people. She said, well, I've never heard him say that. Talking with some folks yesterday, live near here, not my immediate kin that I was talking about, but someone else. And I knew him during high school days, and knew his dad. I said, your dad was a preacher, wasn't he? He said, well, he wasn't a preacher, but he preached. I said, I've heard him preach, but he wasn't, a pastor of a church and such. And I said, are you a preacher? And he identified himself as a believer and said he'd been saved about 30 years ago and said, I'm not going to church, but we'll meet in the house. Meet in my house, said, most every Sunday. And we were listening to some messages from a preacher that used to live in Christiansburg and moved away to another state. And we were listening to his messages. And you say, well, I guess that's better than nothing, but there's no structure there of leaders in the church. There's no accountability of discipline and exhorting one another. It's kind of a family thing. We're listening to the preacher. Well, assembly is what Paul wrote to. He was writing to the pastor of an assembly, a group of people, not just family people, but people from all walks of life that get saved and come to know the Lord Jesus, and they become part of God's family. And so meeting together is part of it. And I see that it's 11, and I'll finish up this last point real quick here. But this verse 16 is part of conducting ourselves properly in the church by bearing witness to the truth. Bearing witness to the truth. It says that, the last part of verse 15, that the church of the living God is the pillar and ground of the truth. The pillar and ground of the truth. In other words, there's a solid foundation, the ground, and the pillars hold it up. Church is not the source of truth, but it maintains the truth. Sometimes I drive around the countryside and I see these old buildings, old barns that are falling down. And I guess they're too expensive. It's hard work to tear down an old building, and I guess too expensive to get somebody else moving, so people just leave them, let them fall over. And I'm kind of fascinated with that sometimes. I think a time or two I've seen buildings that I've been inside of, and now they're falling over. And if we quit preaching the truth, if we quit presenting what the message says here about the Lord Jesus, He was manifest in flesh. God was manifest in flesh in the person of Jesus. He was justified in the Spirit. He is virgin born, conceived by the Holy Spirit. His miracles were done by the Holy Spirit. The day of His baptism, the Holy Spirit descended in the form of a dove, and He was filled without measure of the Spirit to preach and to do the miracles that He did while He was on earth. Jesus was seen of angels from the time of His birth till the time of His resurrection and time that He ascended into heaven. The angel said He's coming back. He is preaching to the Gentiles. He was believed on in the world and received up into glory, and He's coming back. If you and I quit preaching that message, the building's going to collapse. Because there's a lot of people around who wants to tear down the building. A lot of them are political leaders. And if we quit presenting the truth, the building's going to fall down. They'll take away the pillars and the groundwork. But if we conduct ourselves properly, as we ought to, we'll be bearing witness to the truth. We keep praying, Thy kingdom come. And somebody said, if you pray Thy kingdom come, we're praying, my kingdom go. Lord, you come to establish your kingdom here on earth, and our kingdoms of this world will be gone. And we need to keep that message before the people in the church, and the church people go out and present that message to the world. So I guess I'm done for right now. Thank you.